So far, we have had extraordinary moderators, but now I'm happy to introduce the first professional moderator, the Puls 4 News Director, Corinna Milborn, together on the panel with Nikolaus Stockhammer, Rasa Ostrauskaite, Arthur Rachwald, and Peter Neumann. And the topic is preventing and countering violent extremism and radicalization that lead to terrorism.
Thank you, Hannes. Thanks a lot, and thanks for having me. I want to join all the people who thank the organizers. It's a great conference. Thanks for taking the efforts and putting together such great panels. I have a very distinguished panel here, and we were going to talk about violent extremism and radicalization leading to terrorism, how to prevent it and how to combat it. Please welcome Rasa Ostrauskaite. She's the coordinator of activities to address transnational threats at OSCE. Previously, she worked at the Conflict Prevention Center and in various positions at the EU and at the Foreign Ministry of Lithuania. Welcome, Mrs. Ostrauskaite. We have Nikolaus Stockhammer here. He works at the Scientific Cluster of Polymology and Legal Ethics. That's a joint project of the University of Vienna and of the Austrian National Defense Academy. And he's a frequent guest on our news explaining terrorism. He centers on terrorism and security issues. Welcome, thanks for being here. We have Arthur Rachwald here to my side. He's Emeritus Professor at the US Naval Academy, and he's now a visiting professor here at the Diplomatic Academy of Vienna. He deals with international security issues, centering on NATO and on Russia, and will give us the geopolitical perspective on our issue. And finally, Peter Neumann, Professor of Security Studies at the Department of War Studies at the King's College in London. And he's also the Chairman's Special Representative on Countering Violent Radicalization here at the OSCE, appointed shortly. And Peter, I would ask that you start us off with the topic, perhaps explaining what are we talking about, what are the big issues we're talking about. In your recent book, you say that there is not this one reason for radicalization and terrorism. So how can we counter this? How can we combat something that has so many different reasons and roots?
All right, so thank you for having me on the panel. I think it's very obvious for anyone who studies this subject that it's quite impossible to identify the holy grail, to identify the one reason why people become terrorists, or the one formula consisting of several elements explaining why people become terrorists. However, if you do look at what we've learned empirically about why people become extremists, why and how people become extremists, there are 4 or 5 elements that you can identify that often pop up in people's trajectories. And one is certainly the idea of grievance or frustration. In all situations where terrorism has arisen, there was a fault line, a social or political fault line that caused people to be aggrieved and that allowed them to be susceptible. There's secondly, of course, in many cases, there are emotional needs. People who join extremist or violent groups are looking for things. They're looking for identity, for community, for a sense of belonging, for structure, for orientation. There is, thirdly, of course, always an ideology that picks up those grievances and those emotional needs and channels them into a particular political project. That's very important. Without ideas underpinning it, it doesn't become politically motivated violence. There's fourthly a social element. Typically, with very rare exceptions that we talk about as genuine lone wolves, but very rare exceptions, there is a social element to it. There are countercultures out of which extremist groups emerge, charismatic leaders, cliques, that allow people to egg each other on and exert, for example, pressure on each other. And then fifthly, and finally, there's sometimes violence that creates more violence. Violence has a radicalizing effect in and by itself. And in fact, one factor that is often forgotten is if you look, for example, at the international database of terrorist incidents that is maintained by the University of Maryland, you will find that 80% of terrorist incidents happen in just 5 countries. And those 5 countries are Nigeria, Syria, Iraq, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. These are countries that are affected by violent conflict. So violent conflict produces terrorism, and terrorism produces violent conflict. There is a circular logic at play here. I would even go further. Even some of the remaining 20% of terrorist incidents that don't happen in those 5 countries are actually inspired by what happens in those 5 countries. So ultimately, addressing violent extremism and violent radicalization is very much at the core of the OSCE mission, which is about addressing conflicts. And if we understand that terrorism and radicalization into terrorism and conflicts are related in many cases, then it becomes obvious that this has to be an important part of the mission. So it is those five elements. Of course, they are combined in different ways. In each individual, you will find different issues becoming more important than others. There are certainly people who are quite intellectual, who are interested in ideas. For them, ideas are more important. Then there are other people for whom that is less important, and they're more followers. They go to Syria, for example, to join groups like Islamic State because their friends have gone and they want to stay with their friends. So it is different in each individual person, but typically you do find these 5 elements in most of the stories you read about when people end up being terrorists.
The topic is so strongly linked to migration in the public discussion right now. And in fact, we have 2 groups that could be dangerous in Europe right now. One are racist groups that act against migrants. We don't call them terrorists often, but the acts are very similar. And the other one is radical Islamist groups. How would you draw the link between the topic of migration, also of refugees, to radicalization?
So that's obviously, this is a very contentious topic in Austria, in Germany, where I come from. And it's important to be very careful here. First of all, it's important to emphasize that as a special representative, I look at all forms of radicalization, whether it is into jihadist terrorism or whether it is into far-right extremism or even separatist terrorism. That's the first important point to make. The second important point to make is that, of course, the threat that we're currently facing in Europe from jihadists in particular, followers of the Islamic State, is not predominantly from people who've come to Europe as refugees. In fact, to the contrary, we know that 5,000 Western Europeans have gone to Syria in order to join Islamic State, some of whom, exactly, and some of whom have now come back. If you look at, for example, the attacks in Paris and Brussels, those were, with 2 exceptions, all Europeans who'd gone to Islamic State and returned as so-called foreign terrorist fighters. It is, of course, true, and we've seen that in Germany last year, that amongst the people who have come to Europe, there is a small number of people who have radicalized. I have not met one representative from any security agency in any country in Europe who would have said to me that refugees are particularly prone to radicalization or that they are more radicalized than perhaps other problematic groups within our own societies. The problem with refugees is not that they are more radicalized. The problem is that many of them we do not know, and we have no idea where they came from, what situations they came from. In many cases, they are not properly identified. So that makes it particularly difficult to find the very few within that population who may be interested in doing us harm. But the very last point is a very important. Recognizing that it is very, very few of them also actually makes it obvious that the path forward, realizing, cognizant of the fact that we do not know who they are, is to seek partnership with the vast majority of people that have come to us, because they are the ones who are critical in helping us track down the very few who may want to do us harm. So I know it's very difficult to speak about this in nuanced ways. I think it would be a huge mistake.
That's what the conference there
exactly. It would be a huge mistake.
Go ahead.
In the public debate, it's either all of them are terrorists, or, in fact, none of them are terrorists. And neither position is entirely right. We're not doing ourselves any favors if we ignore this issue. But it's very important to speak about it in a nuanced way and to keep a sense of proportion.
I'd like to come back to you later about prevention, but first, Nicholas, could you give us your take on how to combat these threats? What do we have to do in OSCE countries in order to prevent or in order to combat, actually, terrorism?
Thank you very much for having me here. Thank you very much for your kind introduction. It's a tough question you're starting with. Combating radicalization, Peter Neumann has just pointed out some crucial points, his elements of radicalization. I think we need to tackle each and every element he just pointed to, and we have to be aware of two different approaches. There is this, I would rather call it European approach, which is centered around the individual, and then we have this American approach, which is centered around society and the attitude of acting. And so we can address the microsociology of the individual, or we can address the society as a whole. This is one basic aspect. We also have to say that we are now facing a new form of hybrid terrorism, as I would call it. I have not invented this term, but I think it shows quite well that this new threat is a new combination of several factors that makes this threat even more dangerous. We have a hybrid phenomenology concerning terrorist groups. We have ISIS being a fully fledged terrorist organization, but also being a militia. We have homegrown jihadists and homebound jihadists. We have opportunity attacks, as I would call it, or we have network-based attacks. So we have very different forms, and we have to adapt to these forms. And radicalization can go different ways. It can lead to joining such networks, or it can also lead to radicalizing people, and they become lone wolves or similar perpetrators.
Professor Rockwald, could you give us your take on the geopolitical backgrounds of the whole thing? You deal with NATO and how NATO acts in the world. Many of those who radicalize have strong anti-American sentiments and see NATO as the main enemy, or the policies that came out of US and NATO. Is there any truth to that? How do you counter these narratives?
Well, anti-Americanism is pretty much an ideology in many countries, and
yes,
certainly
it goes far beyond that.
Yes,
yeah,
it goes beyond this. It's being used by many, and definitely it is an aspect in the fight against terrorism. I would like to start by pointing out that 9/11 in the United States, perhaps Paris attacks in France, are closely linked international terrorism with migration. Right or wrong, but we are speaking of perceptions, of impressions, and this is the issue in particular I would like to shortly address. It is seen that migrants infiltrate countries, that this is the import of instability, of insecurity into the country where the migrants are coming. So labeling migration as a security issue has immediately emotional and definitely political, which is felt in the ballot box above all consequences. To be a little bit academic, if you don't mind, I will.
That's why we love to have you.
Oh, thank you. I would like to say that the perception of insecurity related to migration can be divided at least into three component parts. And it could be, first of all, the social insecurity, economic insecurity, and thirdly, public safety insecurity. Some even extend it into environmental insecurity. But you can see it's becoming very broad spectrum, and it touches everybody's daily life. And this is why it is so powerful. As far as societal insecurity is concerned, many people see it as a threat to cultural, linguistic, as well as religious feelings. consequently to the very core of national identity. And it is happening not only in relatively homogeneous countries, but in the countries which pride themselves to be culturally diverse, like United States. We'll have to speak about recent elections. Even Canada, for example, France or Belgium, and so on. Speaking on a much broader, let's say, geopolitical spectrum is happening, we see de facto transformation of ethnically based states into heterogeneous kind of a political units, where what divides people is not the ethnicity, not the religion, language, etc., but the only thing what unites them is hopefully acceptance of the same political rules. I mentioned, secondly, an issue of economic security, and this is the one which touches just directly at the kitchen table and your pocket. And it involves perception, and I stress perception, that migrants are a threat to national economy and above all to yours and mine job security. So consequently, it is extension of the issue of economic issue into the realm of security and looking at it as a security issue rather than issues of numbers, and it becomes obviously highly emotional. And it is possible, and I think it is not incorrect, to look at migration as a movement of labor. And the perception, consequently, is that there is a new labor force which, first of all, lowers standards of living because it depreciates wages. So instead of hiring Anglo as a gardener in California, you hire Mexican, and the price is very, very considerably different. Yes, that it is draining state resources for welfare, for unemployment, and above all the medical benefits. What is also particularly important in United States, where constitutionally, at least to some extent, education is locally founded. It is a perception of migrants as free riders, because they don't own property to pay taxes, because property taxes pay for education. So they get a free ride, and they use local educational system without really contributing nothing to it. So they take jobs for native-born workers, and they lower standard of living and drain national resources. Thirdly, I would like to state that the issue of migration became a major issue of domestic security. It is, in my opinion, most clearly evident in the United States by the establishment of the Department of Homeland Security. It is institutionalization of migration as a threat to national security. And it is a perception also is implied in it that if you restrict migration, you increase security at home, that there is a relationship right there. The biggest, in my opinion, issue is this concept of war on terror. It is not a military campaign or police campaign against terror. It is a war on terror. I think in the United States, the concept of war has less of an emotional load than it is in Europe, because war means you send your boys abroad, they beat the hell out of someone and come back and everything is fine. Still, it is a war. It is an international, a global war against terror. It is a very ambiguous concept at the same time, against whom you don't point out to a country, maybe to individual, Osama bin Laden or so. But it is a very dangerous concept, well, ambiguous, I would like to say, concept. But it also brings a link between migration and security. The result is, I mentioned, a war on terror. Much more strict border control, including building of wall between United States and Mexico. By the way, idea of the wall, don't give Trump a credit for it. It was President Clinton who first came up with the idea of building a wall, and partially built the wall, so did Obama. And probably the most sensitive, it results in restrictions on civil rights. So here is the perhaps the most direct threat to democracy. Lastly, migration is in many perception of many people directly related to the public safety. And here comes the concept of the soccer mom. It's especially powerful during it was Bush versus Al Gore, a presidential campaign. Who is the soccer mom? She is a relatively young woman with children, probably with democratic liberal leanings, but she's afraid, and she will vote Republican. If you scare her enough because of protection of her children, she will vote Republican, and it worked. It worked a number of times. So it tells you how that image, perhaps castle built up in the air, really works well at the ballot box. I look at statistical evidence for the correlation between migration and criminality, and I can bring you statistics on both sides of the argument. You can prove this, you can prove that. I don't know. I started my life in communist system, so I am very suspicious of statistics. You can prove whatever you want. And I would not use my example. Anyway, the impression, a correlation between public safety and migration. Well, from personal experience, when I drive to Los Angeles, you can tell who is driving and how. There are different cultures of driving, depending, but not only on age, but also on ethnicity. The perception is that migrants bring what? Crimes, theft, public disorder, traffic violations, robbery, homicides, and above all, drugs and gangs and gang violence. This is the perception. And it becomes political issue and can be very easily exploited at the ballot box. I have one more comment, if you don't mind, because I was asked what OSCE could do about this. And my comment is, first of all, let OSCE do what OSCE is created for, does the best. It has a niche in addressing a security issue. It is not NATO. It is not European Union. It is not anything else. OSCE does certain things well. And in particular, what I would like to make recommendations, etc. If you look at the mission of the organization, its operational experience, it is good at monitoring. It brings facts. I don't want to say real facts because I always correct my students. Facts.
They should not be alternative anyway.
Not the manufactured facts, but those things which really happen. And this is very important for the pragmatic, unemotional, because terrorism brings a lot of emotion for obvious and good reason. But perhaps to make a conclusion, how should we address the issue? We should start with reality and forget emotions, and for that reason. In particular, and using California example, once again, you can see this kind of a schizophrenic attitude toward Mexicans. We absolutely hate Mexicans, but we love Maria and Jose. And maybe by facts we can bridge and overcome that kind of schizophrenic attitude. And secondly and lastly, build public awareness that terrorism, it's not really such have to be careful, huge global problems. There are few countries involved. There are unfortunately some individuals who are casualties to it. Bring it down to its scale and proportion, and then address the issue in a pragmatic way and in hope for a resolution.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the insights. And the recommendation, that goes to you. So what can OSCE do, and what are your plans in doing? Let's talk about radicalization.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, I will pick up on a couple of points. And first of all, the Secretary General this morning mentioned that we live in the twilight zone. And I think in this particular twilight zone, if there is one issue on which there seems to be agreement, or at least there are no clear, visible cleavages, and that is terrorism. Everybody agrees on the importance of having this issue addressed, unlike the issues that we discussed in a few panels, like on protracted conflicts or on the importance of human rights and fundamental freedoms, I mean, where you clearly see many more cleavages. Another issue, and that's to draw on Sergei Markedonov and the blah, 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 and the core stuff. So, I mean, if counterterrorism is what we saw, like security, kind of strong perspective, this is the core, and then the radicalization, or what kind of you suggested. OSCE is approaching the issue with this slightly softer approach, so the blah blah blah. So that seems to be the running theme for all the panels. No, so for us, counterterrorism is a key issue, and it's clearly very high on our agenda, and we do have a mandate. We have a mandate from a number of ministerial council decisions, and for example, the issue of counter-radicalization, or as we call it, preventing and countering violent extremism that lead to terrorism, or VERLT. This is one of the terms or the acronyms that we use so extensively in the context of the OSCE. That we had a council decision in Belgrade, and from that particular moment, I mean, our activities only picked up, and we had a number of them. Now, one of them, of course, and this is the appointment of Peter Neumann. This is the first time that the OSCE has recognized the issue of being of such importance that we even have appointed the chair or the chairperson in office, Minister Kurz, appointed a special representative. I mean, just to promote the issue. I mean, to raise the awareness, but also to showcase that OSCE has a lot to contribute. I mean, and so that also shows that OSCE is an actor. Yes, I mean, I understand we're not, as you said, we're not NATO, we're not EU, but there are lots of things that we can do, and also the fact that we have such a broad membership, and they can bring countries which maybe frame different issues in somewhat different contexts and somewhat differently. The fact that we all managed to agree on the importance of this softer approach of countering terrorism through a number of activities of preventing and countering VERLT is very big. So now, how exactly do we do it? We have a number of ways to address it. And one of them is, and I would like to immediately recognize someone who is sitting in the second row, and that is Vera. Vera, please stand up. She is the one, she is behind our United CBE campaign, United Countering Violent Extremism campaign which has reached out to 22 million people. This is probably the most successful OSCE campaign that we have ever launched. What is this campaign about? This campaign is about reaching out and challenging stereotypes, allowing and giving the platform, especially to young people, including on Twitter, Facebook, you name it, to challenge stereotypes, to suggest that migrant and refugee does not equal terrorist, does not equal criminal, is not there to take the work or whatever well-being that is there, for example, in Europe, to show your testimonials, to share your experience. So one of them is this public awareness campaign and challenging many stereotypes. And I'm not talking exclusively about the refugee and migrant crisis. I'm talking about any stereotypes that might lead to violent extremism. Another issue that we are pursuing, and that is capacity building. And this is a new campaign, a new initiative that we are launching this year, and that is called LIFE. Leaders Against Intolerance and Violent Extremism. It's a campaign to build the civil society's capacity, and we're targeting different audience. And these are maybe credible voices, so to say. These are women, these are religious leaders, these are traditional leaders, and these are youth leaders. So we are now piloting a special training course. Actually, this very week, I mean, we had a number of young people from all over the OSCE area, from Central Asia, from the Balkans, coming to Vienna and actually checking, and we're testing this particular training course now. And once this course is tested, I mean, we will be enrolling, and then we will be expanding it to women's leaders and traditional leaders. leaders. Because one of the key things, I mean, everybody talks about counter-narratives. But in order for you to articulate a really good, credible counter-narrative, this has to come from a credible source. Recently, I was part of the Munich Security Conference, and then there was a Google representative who said, if the government endorses your counter-narrative, you can know you failed your mission. I mean, you really need to have, if you have a counter-narrative, it needs to come from within someone who is credible in a small group, in a society, in a community, might be a small village, but that person, so that's why we need to target people who can bring this very credible voice to. Another issue that I want, also where OSCE is quite visible, and that is mainstreaming gender. Why is it important? And actually, and this is if there is one remark that I wanted to make to the organizers of this conference, there are very few women. And the first 3 panels, and we only saw one woman on the panel. So, we should, this is 50% of the society, and we have to make sure that women are represented. And mainstreaming gender in our operational responses to both terrorism or radical extremism is extremely important. Last year, we had a first meeting of technical experts where actually we discussed how women could contribute to these operational responses to terrorism. And let's not see, just look at the number of women who went and joined ISIS, or, for example, of how many women contribute. We sometimes think about it like, how do you manage, or what is the profile of a typical quote-unquote terrorist? And sometimes we overlook things and people because we simply don't think in these very broad terms. And having women part of a group is very important. It's about targeting women, it's about targeting mothers, it's about targeting small communities. And women can be, early warning voices, which we sometimes simply overlook. And I will continue afterwards. I am quite conscious of the time. So.
I'll come back to you. I just like to make a stop and have a reaction from Mr. Neumann. Is that the way to de-radicalize? Because I've read a lot of experts saying that de-radicalization doesn't work unless somebody wants to be de-radicalized. So if somebody is on the way to being radicalized and on the way to extremism, you can't touch them anymore. Can you, if you target them via women, via traditional leaders?
So when we're talking about CVE or prevention, all these efforts are obviously aimed at different target groups. When you're talking about de-radicalizing someone, you're talking about someone who is radicalized already. When you're talking about programs that are aimed at parents, educational programs, stuff like that, it's not actually aiming people who are radicalized, it is aiming people who may at some point become susceptible to the messages of violent extremists with the intention of, if you want, inoculating them against the appeal of violent extremism.
Could you say who are these people?
So it's about prevention. It's about young people. It's basically the preventative approach is not unique to violent extremism. Mm-hmm. You have drug prevention going on in schools. You have preventive programs that aim at all kinds of negative or illegal behaviors that target young people, not because 11-year-olds are drug users, but because we know that at some point in the course of growing up, somebody might approach them and may tempt them with drugs. And it's the same with countering violent extremism. A lot of the preventative programs are not aimed at people who are radicalized, they are aimed at people who may at some point be susceptible to the messages of violent extremism. In many respects, it's actually a form of civic education. But then, of course,
there is... Could you say more or less, how many people are we talking about? How many young people? Is it all the people between 15 and 20, or...?
No. Look, we're still talking about very small numbers of people, of course. But what we've seen, especially over the past 5 years, is, especially in Europe as well, is that it's no longer that easy to predict. So when we look, for example, at who's gone to Syria from Western Europe, you can see that for the first time, we have very significant numbers of women and girls. So the idea that every extremist is a man is no longer true. We've seen in Europe between 20 and 30% converts, people who do not come from Muslim families or Muslim communities, who have converted to Salafi jihadism and gone to Syria.
Within
And so-
months sometimes.
Within weeks or months sometimes. So it's no longer that easy to predict. It's no longer a case of, oh, I go into a Muslim community because they're all potential terrorists. That's certainly, I mean, even if you wanted to believe, it doesn't work because it's not true. It's empirically not true. But one point that I wanted to make is a very important one. So this is prevention. And then on the other end, you have de-radicalization. And it's, of course, wrong. And I'm, as someone who has studied this for many years, I would be the first one to agree. Not everyone can be radicalized. There's not a single tool that is used against terrorism that works in every single case. And it is absolutely true, and I think you were citing me when you gave that quote, that just
You're
like...
right. Not only, but
well,
you're right.
that just like quitting smoking, you cannot force someone to quit smoking if he doesn't want to quit smoking. And believe me, I've been in that place. So there has to be a question. There has to be a doubt. There has to be something that a program that is aimed at de-radicalizing someone can leverage and can make bigger. And then you can help someone get out and reintegrate and rebuild their social network and test their new ideas. But if someone is very happy to be an extremist and is determined to blow things up, I would be the first one to say that person needs to be locked up and society needs to be protected from that person. De-radicalization is not some
you
kind
on
of
prisons and radicalizations in a minute.
De-radicalization is not some sort of voodoo brainwashing where you're kind of hypnotizing someone and suddenly that person becomes a liberal Democrat. That's not how it works. In fact, in many cases, de-radicalization programs are not exclusively about ideology. They are also about psychological needs, social needs. They're about creating a program that allows you to leave behind a past that you yourself are willing to leave behind.
Is that the blah blah answer, and is there a boom boom answer too? Asking you as a military expert.
I think there are some tough points in it as well, but I would like to start with a confirmation of one crucial point that has been made now by Peter Neumann, which is that radicalization goes on in stages. You have to address the very bottom stage where it all begins, where people are susceptible to radicalization, and it is really hard to tackle those who have been fully radicalized at the top of the radicalization pyramid. So it means any measures have to address the bottom line. But what seems important to me, and I would like to add this point, you have also to address the sympathizers and those who channelized this movement and the justifiers. And this can only be done by creating a counter-narrative. And this is one big issue, I think, where OSCE can provide important ammunition to fight this phenomenon. The hard answer, so to say, the boom-boom answer is, I don't think that de-radicalization or preventing radicalization can be addressed with a boom-boom method. I think you can...
so the war on terror...
Fight, yeah,
even if the military, in France, for example, now it's not only a police matter, it's also a military matter to combat terrorism.
The war on terrorism was a paradigm that had to fail by itself, because you cannot win a war against an enemy that is clandestine. You cannot, there is the time factor playing against you, and you have to justify yourself into a logic of winning a war or losing a war, and you can only lose this war. So I think what it is necessary today in counterterrorism is to have a new paradigm, a paradigm which I would call counterterrorism paradigm, not a war on terror paradigm and not a criminal law paradigm, because terrorism as we see it today has become something in between war and crime. You see that when you regard the methods of perpetrating, you have military means, you have ways of attacking simultaneously in a manner that guerrilla warfare would suggest to do it. So the new paradigm in countering terrorism is a comprehensive approach. You have to include all the resources and all the ammunition, I would say, you have. Yeah, this is the boom boom
But
factor.
not the boom boom,
Yeah,
the blah blah
the
ammunition.
ammunition, not physically, but counter arguments to go directly into this problem.
Because you said, Professor Raffat, that in your statement that this whole linking of migration and security rather created threats than reducing threats. But what would be the answer that reduces threats?
I would.
Is it what OSCE does? Is it what Mrs. Osterkaite told us?
As I see it, the majority of the issue, the main thrust of the issue, is the perception. And this has to be addressed. The perception which comes immediately on a personal level, that what is your association, mental association, between terrorism and the face, between terrorism and the dress, and terrorism and nationalities. And it is at the dinner table. This is where it begins to grow. That there is association of people with the Middle Eastern origin. What the first reaction is, they could be terrorists. If you see a person up from Northern Europe, you don't have that association. So it's a deeply cultural issue, and it has two aspects to it. You know where the problem is, but it will take a very long time to change that perception, because it takes one incident or two, or not many, to reinforce that negative perception. And that perception is everywhere. Go to a movie, go to a public place, and you automatically think in this kind of a defensive stereotype type of manner. So I guess that could be the beginning. And secondly, which I argue very strongly, give us facts, real facts, where these facts really are. Because not for everybody, but what I am afraid, including this audience right here, the discussion like this one takes place among sort of experts, people interested in these issues, etc. This is not a discussion which you will find in the daily paper. So it really doesn't trickle down, if I can use ergonomics.
You'll find it on our news today because I interviewed Mr. Neumann for it. Bringing this to the dinner table, that's what you try to do. I've just one question before we go to the audience. If you look at the past 1.5 years, the topic, if we take this as true, that perceptions matter, have really gone wrong then, because since September 2015, the linkage between terrorism and migration has grown so much stronger in public perception. Are you able to place this counter-narrative in this environment?
I'd like to reframe it. I think I'm not sure if it's if my answer would like, yes, we have. And the fact that we're still discussing, I mean, I would clearly be pointing a finger at myself. That means we have failed. I think we have failed jointly. I mean, it's not the OSCE's role to put this counter-narrative. I think it's everybody's problem, both general publics, but also the statesmen. I mean, how many statesmen and how many political leaders we had who easily put this equation mark between the refugee and the migrant and the criminal. And, you know, numbers don't necessarily support that particular case. But yes, so we do have a lot to do in addressing this issue, because what we have seen in the last year and a half or so is that clearly this migration crisis or a refugee crisis, I mean, you know, however you name it, led to a greater polarization in our societies. And I'm not talking about, you know, one particular country. It's actually across the entire OSCE area. We have also seen an uptick in an upsurge in violence, in hate crime, in marginalization of both new immigrants but also minorities. Clearly that leads to these deeper problems, and unless we address this issue, we may end up having a much bigger issue to address in the future. And that is, I mean, this, because as Professor Neumann you know, mentioned, one of the key narratives of terrorists, it's about grievances. So, I mean, these grievances, be that of newly arrived refugees and migrants, or be that of further marginalized minorities, they may lead or may push these people to accepting these populist or very violent extremist ideologies. I mean, it's a much huge problem that we will end up facing. So yes, it is our responsibility to keep, reframing and saying, no, refugee and a migrant is not a criminal and is definitely not necessarily a potential terrorist. I mean, yes, and the fact that we have this now current social media, which limits us to 140, for example, signs, limits us because we're not giving them a nuanced position. We end up usually, saying things in very simplistic way and rather than giving a more complex and comprehensive answer. So yes, please keep interviewing experts who would actually give a much more refined answers, which will allow us to deconstruct the narrative of danger which surrounds the issue of the migrant and the refugee.
Yeah, but people will tell you, Mr. Neumann, that the danger is there because they see the terrorist attacks and they see the victims, so they will tell you fake news.
So it's very obvious that people are fearful and that people are afraid, and you can't ban fear. You can't say to people, you're not allowed to be afraid, you're not allowed to have fears, because they clearly do. And it is equally true, however, of course, what everyone in every discussion points out, namely that terrorism doesn't actually kill that many people. I mean, there's all these statistics out there. More people fall out of their windows every year, die in bathtubs, lightning causes more deaths than terrorism. I mean, that's all true. It's statistically true. But of course, lightning is not a politically motivated act, and that's, of course, what makes terrorism different. And what makes terrorism different, and it seems like a banal thing to say, but it's always important to point that out, terrorism is about creating terror. That's the essence of terrorism. And the so-called Islamic State has understood that perhaps better than any other terrorist organization before, because it realizes we don't actually have to kill a lot of people. If you behead one person on the streets of Vienna, it will, within a day, change the entire discourse around Islam, around minorities, and not in a good way. So, if anything, this kind of terrorism has made us realize how fragile our societies are. The fact that in France, for example, we're now talking about, however remote a prospect it is, that a far-right populist can become president of France has something to do with the terror acts that have happened. And now imagine there is another attack 1 week before the election. That will totally change the dynamics. And now imagine also that all it takes is someone to rent a truck and drive into a crowd. And it really makes you almost stunned at how fragile our societies are, but it also makes you realize that even though technically it doesn't kill a lot of people, it's very important to address this threat because it threatens the fabric of our entire societies, how we live together as people in democracies who have different faiths, who come from different communities. It's very, very important, even though it's right, it's mostly about what happens in our head, not necessarily about Islamic State taking over Austria. That's not going to happen, but they have the power to mess with our ideas and our fears.
Mm-hmm. Without killing a lot of people, you're right.
Exactly.
Are there any questions or statements? That's a lot, okay. I would ask you to keep them short, to a minute. You can also have a statement. You don't have to reframe it as a question if it's not a question. And I'll start, I'll come to you later here because the microphone. Please, the lady there that's there, yes.
Hi, my name is Basma Salama. I'm a former junior researcher. I'm a former junior researcher at the Austrian National Defense Academy, and my first question goes to the OSCE, Ms. Ostraskaite. We already know that around 1,500 foreign fighters have returned to Europe, and that so far it has been hard to deal with the already identified returnees due to the lacking national structures and concepts and the resulting lack of investment in these necessary programs. So my question is, how can or how has the OSCE been helping its member states to develop a national concept to encourage more investment in prevention strategies and counter-radicalization programs? And my second question is to Professor Neumann.
Let's have an answer right away, and then you pose the second question, please.
We have several avenues of approaching this. First of all, we have...
Pardon?
Yeah, she wants to answer first, and then...
No, I'd like to hear the answer first, because then the second question will have the answer right away. So we hear question and answer, please.
So 4 different ways. First of all, we have established what we call foreign terrorist fighter mobile teams. This is, in fact, these are 3 different teams, 2 English-speaking, 1 Russian-speaking, which we can deploy at any point, at any different, for example, either cross-boarding or cross-boarding checkpoint or a national airport, and where we can train frontline officials to see how you can actually detect, how you can interrogate, how you can question, what you may potentially see as for example, foreign terrorist fighter. And now that the pressure in Syria, Iraq increases clearly, we will be seeing many more returnees to European states. So that's number 1. Number 2, we have also stepped up our activities when it comes to helping participating states to develop their national capacities to detect forged documents and imposters, because lots of people who are returning to Europe, they come back on forged documents. The third thing, and this is the recent decision of the Hamburg Ministerial Council, and that is advanced passenger information. We also help participating states to develop their systems, the so-called API systems, which allow them to check and cross-check the names of those who are flying into Europe, and quite a few now, those who are returnees from Syria, Iraq, via Turkey or any other neighboring state. They use broken travel, i.e. they travel somewhere else, but then they stop over, in Europe and they stay there. So we allow participating states to check these potential returnees against the databases. So, they can already know that there is, the alarm would start blinking, that they know who is coming. And the last one, of course, we do what we call tabletop exercises. Tabletop exercises is an extremely efficient way of bringing a number of actors. For the time being, for example, so it's not only just officials working at the airport, but different actors involved in this sphere or in this type of business. Working together to build an efficient system and to come up with a response which would be operationally credible.
Thank you.
And then you have a question for Mr. Neumann.
In your recent book, you explain or refer to the so-called democratization of jihadism, where the Islamic State does not only recruit or targets 2nd or 3rd generation young European Muslim men, but has an overall wider reach. How do you believe will the so-called democratization of jihadism have an impact on or shape prevention strategies and programs?
Thank you. Please.
Well, very briefly, this refers to what I talked about before, which is that the demographics have become much more diverse, and you see women, you see a lot of converts, you see, for example, a lot of jihadists who have criminal pasts, who were gang members. That was not necessarily the case 15 or 20 years ago. And that, of course, makes it a lot more difficult, in a way, to target prevention efforts, because in essence, in theory at least, anyone could be susceptible. So it makes it more difficult, and that's why it's so important that organizations like OSCE have picked up on these changes and are trying to emphasize, for example, programs particularly for girls and women, and for some of these emerging groups that actually are different from the standard type of extremists that we imagined in the past.
Thank you. There's a question there, 2 rows before you. Yes, please.
Thank you. Distinguished experts, I would like to push you out from the European framework a bit. I am a student at the Diplomatic Academy here, and I'm a citizen of Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan is also a member of OSCE, and therefore I'm particularly concerned about not migration, but extremism at home, and the growing wave of extremism in such countries, especially as Tajikistan. It didn't come yet to my country, but what if it does? And what could the OSCE do in that regards, not, let's say, in regards to the European crisis? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very good question. It's a number of OSCE countries, also in the Balkans.
But I mean, since you picked up on Tajikistan, we had a number of events, including in Tajikistan itself. The Tajik government is extremely interested in having very close cooperation with the OSCE. They rely on our expertise a lot. We have a number of events, both involving Tajik officials, I mean, sometimes jointly with the Afghan officials. We have Border Management Staff College, which addresses some of these issues, because, I mean, we bring together experts, some of those who work on the border, so in order to make sure that some of the border management and security related issues are concerned. Now, in particular, when it comes to, for example, the how do you fight radicalization in Tajikistan, some of the strategies and attempts on how the OSCE approaches, it's not that different. You have to choose different narratives, as Professor Neumann mentioned. But in a way, I mean, it's not that we necessarily target a particular type of radicalization, you know, based in Europe, and because of migration and refugee crisis. I mean, we simply kind of focus because the moderator pushed us into this particular dimension and direction.
The organizers also.
Of the organizers. Let's put it like this. Let's push the blame on the organizers. But in fact, I mean, radicalization is ongoing in different societies, and you know, clearly, for example, the fact that you need to include and target families and parents, that you have to focus on traditional and religious leaders. I mean, in Tajikistan in particular, while we have this political / religious clash, you know, or perception, I mean, again, I mean, as someone framed, someone's terrorist and somebody else, you know, fighter, etc. So you have a number of cleavages that you have to address, but I mean, some of the strategies that I pointed out, I mean, focusing on credible voices, building capacity both of local communities. I mean, you have to, you know, you can address it at different levels, both at the macro level, where you talk about the general community, and you can address it at meso level, where we focus about specific community, like be that a village or a city, and then at the micro level, where we target individuals.
There's a question here in the third row. Oh, yes, yeah, let's take this one first, because the microphone is there, and then I'll take
Thank you very much.
Next.
Colin Munro, former UK ambassador to the OSCE. My question is about education and Islam. We're talking about, we hear about Islamic extremism. There's a perception, I think, certainly in my country, and I think also in Austria, that a lot of extremist propaganda is pushed out in the name of Islam, in schools and in mosques. We had an infamous case in the UK of a preacher who was Abu Hamza. We tried for years to deport him. And at the same time, we have this fundamental right for parents to educate their children in the religion of their choice and so on. How are we going to get to grips with this problem? Or am I exaggerating it? I may say that I consider segregated education on religious lines to be one of the greatest causes of extremism that one can imagine. You see it in Bosnia, and we saw it in Northern Ireland.
Thank you very much for the excellent question. I think, Mr. Neumann, I think that's for you.
I think it's a question for the OSCE leadership. No, I want to answer your question in a personal capacity, because I know that having worked with international institutions, this is a particularly touchy issue. My personal view is that, and this is my personal view, is that whilst groups like Islamic State or Al-Qaeda perhaps can be located somewhere on the Islamic spectrum, so in that sense they're Islamic, but they are not representing Islam. There's a huge difference here, and I want to give you an example that perhaps makes it easier to understand for everyone who is not a Muslim. Like, I'm a German person who lives in England, and I've lived in England for 19 years. And so whenever some stupid neo-Nazi in Germany does something terrible, people come to me and say, "Ah, you Germans again. Huh? There you are again." And so I'm like, basically, since I'm German, I'm sort of made responsible for the actions of a deranged neo-Nazi, who, of course, I have nothing to do with. I have to say, though, that when I look at those neo-Nazis, I understand, yes, they are German. I cannot deny that they are German and that they are claiming some sort of tradition within German history that undoubtedly exists. So I recognize that they are German, but at the same time, it's very clear that they do not represent Germany. In fact, no one I know who is German is a neo-Nazi or would sympathize with those people. Whilst recognizing that they are German, they do not represent what Germany or Germans represent nowadays in the 21st century. And so I do think it is perfectly possible to say that Salafi jihadism, or whatever you want to call it, represents some sort of fringe element within that huge community of people around the world who claim and who are Muslims, but that in no way do they represent Islam. And I think that's not something that kind of makes Muslims look bad, but I think it's a perfectly sensible way of dealing with this. And it basically also allows you then to make reasonable arguments about it, in a sense that you can say, for example, people like Abu Hamza or Anjem Chowdhury or Abu Qatada were all radical preachers and who basically had a very negative impact on radicalizing a lot of people within Britain over a prolonged period of time, that it is in fact possible to crack down on those people without necessarily offending the community of British Muslims. In fact, you might do them a favor. When Anjem Chowdhury last year was arrested in Britain, this is a person who was an extremely bad influence on British Muslim communities and was instrumental in facilitating the travel of a lot of British Muslims to Syria and Iraq. When he was finally arrested, a lot of British Muslims actually said, finally, someone has done something about it, because this guy has been annoying us for many, many years, and he's been tainting the name of our community for a very, very long time. So I think you can have a reasonable approach to that.
Two-finger. From the OSCE's perspective, we try to not to suggest that there is Islamic radicalization, because that leads to stigmatization. And that, in a way, in turn, leads to radicalization. So we'd rather talk about violent, extremist radicalization, but without really making this equation mark to Islam.
Thank you. Please, now, here in the third row.
Thank you so much. I'm Raphael Pearl with the Partnership for Peace Consortium. And one of the activities that we do is we partner with the OSCE on tabletop exercises to combat violent extremism. I have a question for Raza and for Peter or anybody else who would want to answer it. Very often dealing with government bureaucracies can be a very frustrating experience. I'm sure all of us in our lives, or many of us, have had such experiences. What can the OSCE do to ensure, or to better ensure, that the immigration and migration process, assimilation process, does not become a trigger for radicalization, but rather becomes an instrument of mainstreaming?
Thank you.
It clearly goes beyond the competences of my department, which deals exclusively with anti-terrorism. I think one of the reasons, and it's a very fair point, and it's a very fair question, but I think it takes what we call whole of society and a whole of government approach, because issues that you're currently, or the topic that you currently raised, it requires contribution from many different aspects. Economic opportunities, education, how do we integrate, how do we make sure that, the already existing minorities or, the so-called old, immigrants or migrants that currently reside within the country are not further marginalized as a result of the influx of new migrants? How do we ensure that these people are not stigmatized and not, basically subjected to living somewhere close to the border? It is a costly affair. And yes, in the context of a budgetary crisis in many, be that EU or European countries, it is an issue that requires solutions. The fact that we have so many growing populist movements, and the fact that usually politicians have a very short time horizon, i.e. until next elections, clearly many are tempted to think of very short-term rather than longer-term answers or solutions. So it's a fair question, but I'm not there to suggest. I mean, we have a lot of ideas. I mean, and migration is an issue that was in a way, quote unquote, imposed on us by the mere reality that OSCE was suddenly found itself in the midst of this crisis, with so many participating states having so many migrants that they have to address. Migration is not going to go away. I mean, clearly with so many conflicts beyond the borders of the OSCE area, there will be lots of people who will be coming to the OSCE area, and it's a longer term issue. I mean, fair point. No answer from my side.
Thank you. Mr. Stockhammer, you wanted to add something?
From my perspective, I think it's rather an issue of civil society than of international organizations. It is a movement from the bottom to the top, and we should involve moderate Islam into this discussion, especially in the context of those new immigrants who come to a new country, facing a new culture, and they have to get a solid basis for in terms of their behavior here, of their accommodation to new standards. So I think international organizations are at the level above this, and they should guarantee the circumstances and the framework for this moderate narrative of Islam that should be the common basis for those immigrants.
Mr. Bauer?
I would like to quickly address the issue of education, because there is education and there is also indoctrination. And I think it would be very helpful to separate these two and look at the academic subjects, if they are being taught and required, or is the education really ideological? Is it breeding, possibly breeding, or catering to form of terrorism, brings alienation, rejection of the society, the sense of victimhood, and consequently idea of payback to the society, of paying it back in form of terrorism, etc. And it is a very broad subject because we happen to focus on terrorism, which is perhaps the extreme example of alienation, but it is also on the daily basis in terms of personal security, education, that your children don't get educated in public schools because of the number of migrants, etc. And it can go, especially in the United States, to a simple fact that if you have migrants as neighbors, the depreciation of your house would be such that you will never afford to retire. So it is really the issue of security is extremely complex. It does not only, or it should not only focus on the question of terrorism and kind of survival issue.
Thank you. We have time for another round of questions. So let me see. Let's start on this side, please.
My name's Stephen Murphy. I'm a security officer by trade, working usually in crisis areas. Now, since we're talking about terrorism, to my knowledge, the United Nations has not agreed on a definition for the word terrorism. Now, how does that work with the OSCE? One man's freedom fighter is the other man's terrorist, and vice versa. Now, if you're working on it and you've got papers on it, is there a clear definition as to what is a terrorist and what isn't?
Short answer is no. We follow the UN guidance, and since UN failed to agree on the definition of terrorism, we also have not agreed on the definition of terrorism.
Thank you very much. Please, the lady in red, I just see the arm. Yes.
Thank you, Ludmila Bogdan. I'm a DA alumni. And I'm listening to you, and it's very interesting, but at the same time, I'm actually asking myself, and I would like to actually hear your answer, how useful it is, to what extent to actually link so much terrorism to Islam. Does this help more, or can it backfire? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Neumann, would you like to answer?
Wow.
Because
you died before.
Not
I can do
before,
again.
not because you're linking it.
No,
because you
think
are linked to it. Because every time you talk about terrorism on the media, there's this link.
Look, again, as I said before, it's very important, in fact, to delink it and to have a nuanced and reasonable discussion. And just like it is wrong to say that all terrorism is Islamic or Islamic radicalization, things that I think it is quite right to avoid where possible. I think it is equally just a matter of recognizing reality that that's what many people in the West are fearful about, rightly or wrongly. And we have to correct some of these ideas. But of course, if you switch on the TV, and maybe you should talk to people in the media as to how they report it, you're most likely to see people who claim to act for Islamic State or for other groups. So it's not that we're creating this, you know, it's there in society, and it's kind of almost a little bit stupid to say, you know, we the four of us here created the idea of or perpetuating this idea of terrorism being Islamic. I think that people much more influential than us have created that.
If you're interested in that topic on media and terrorism, there's a conference on that on the 21st and 22nd of March in the House of the European Union in Vienna, exactly on that topic, because I guess that's where it comes from. So next question, I take this gentleman here. Yes.
Thank you very much. Being a student of biomedicine and biotechnology and reserve officer, so being not directly affiliated with the political sciences, what would be your hands-on measures to de-radicalize someone? I think this question goes to all of you, since maybe all of you have interesting opinions on this.
Thank you. So who wants to answer it?
I don't want to monopolize everything here, but I mean, like, as I said before, I don't think everyone can be de-radicalized, but I do find it interesting, for example, if I read the most recent report of the German Federal Criminal Office about people who have returned from so-called Islamic State, foreign fighters who've returned, and they pointed out that 20%, over 20% of them are actually collaborating with the authorities. So 20% of them are actually working with the authorities. Many cases are involved, in fact, in bringing prosecutions. We know for fact that some of the people who are returning from there in Iraq are disillusioned. They do have doubts. In some cases, they are so disillusioned that they are willing to work with the authorities to get more people charged. And all I am saying is that we have to be clever when people return. We have to have all the tools in the toolbox. Some people are truly dangerous. Of course, they need to be charged and locked up, and society needs to be protected. Some people are willing to work with the authorities. Fantastic. In Germany, for example, in November, one of the key recruiters for Islamic State, it's been possible to charge him finally because a returnee collaborated with the authorities. Some people are no danger and they do want out. They're truly disillusioned. They're even willing to go into high schools, for example, to warn young kids about not to go there. I think they should be given that opportunity. And so when people are coming back, it's reasonable to say we want to have as many tools as possible so that on a case-to-case basis, on individual basis, we can decide what to do with different kinds of people.
I know you had two excellent questions. I'm looking forward to a third one, but I'll first take people who haven't asked one so far, okay? Please, here.
Alexander Detert from Germany, good evening. I've got an academic background in security studies. That's where my question is coming from. So, purely hypothetically, you were to radicalize somebody and recruit him for an extremist purpose. You would probably identify an individual or individuals with high social grievances, isolate those individuals from mainstream society, and then do radicalize and recruit these individuals. there's a particular group in our society which does carry a high degree of social grievances. I'm talking about the community of refugees. So, ladies and gentlemen, in your opinion, is this community especially prone to radicalization, and what can we do to counter this threat? Thank you.
Mr. Stockhammer, do you want to answer?
I can try to give an answer. It is a difficult question. If you consider the origins of most of those refugees, whether it is societal or personal or religiously, there is a certain tendency that this group is rather endangered to fall over to extremism. But this is that we are not sure in the observation of this topic. We have heard Professor Neumann before that there is not a clear evidence that this group is particularly inclined with radicalization. But nevertheless, we have to observe this group, and we have to prevent radicalization there. De-radicalization for radicalized elements, this is sheerly impossible, as I would see.
Yes?
Yeah, just a few basic comments, partially based on my reading of recruitment to SS or NKVD, etc. So what you should do, first of all, look for a person of the right age, that it's not too old, especially does not have any family obligations. It may happen, but there is an age where people are very susceptible to all kinds of ideas. At the time when they reject society, perhaps reject their own family, etc. This feeling of rejection is very important because, as Professor Neumann mentioned, this is time when the person is disillusioned, and very often is also related to poverty. And this is a person who is vulnerable to some strong, paternalistic, in a sense, but embracing type of feeling. And if someone can give that person sense of importance, so if that person is alienated by the society, now it's time to pay back to that society, to cause a harm in that society. Also, it was mentioned, once the person is being radicalized, isolate that person from the society. And then you have someone with a tremendous negative feeling to a certain group, and I guess religious, ideological issues come to the team. And if you can point out that within that person's family or friends, someone was hurt by the society he or she is turned against, that really works beautifully.
Thank you very much. So, more questions. Could you all raise your hands who have questions so that I have an overview? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Please, let's start here. Do you get a microphone?
So I'm a Syrian refugee student here at the DA, and I have a question. I mean, you all bring up certainly good questions and comments on the terrorism and how it develops, but I haven't heard any reference to resolving the conflicts that you mentioned lead up to the rise in terrorism, or actually...
I said it at the very beginning.
Yes, but what are the elements that the OSCE is willing to put into resolving these conflicts? That is my question.
Thank you very much. Excellent question.
You mentioned Syria. Syria is not within the OSCE area. So there is a certain limit of how we can do, or at least as an institution, I'm not in a position to comment how we can. So this is up to individual member states, and some of them do quite a lot. I'm not in a position to say that OSCE has a particular role in the resolution of the Syrian conflict. I mean, that clearly is well beyond the mandate of the OSCE as an organization.
And so what you said at the beginning, OSCE is not NATO, it's not EU, one of the...
I think the general thrust of the comments is, in a very broad sense, education, education, education. Because OSCE does not have hard means to fight terrorism or perceptions. We change perception by slow, deliberate, very rational process. It unfortunately takes time and patience, and there are victims in the way. But it is manageable. It can change. People change. Societies change. But we have to be persistent, and eventually it's going to happen. And this is the role of the organization.
Thank you. Please, here.
I'm Lisa. Is this on? I'm Lisa Tabassi, OSCE Legal. And education has to lead somewhere. I mean, and besides this question that we're talking about right here, education has to result in jobs and integration and,
Yes.
and building a future. And that's the main thing here, is that people are alienated because they can't find a meaningful purpose for their life when there's no employment out there. So I guess that's another thing OSCE is doing, is in the second dimension, working on economic development in the OSCE region. But this is not happening fast enough globally.
Thank you very much for the comment.
I just want to make a... It makes me think about some 19th century, the concept of organic work. Starts early, education, but also don't forget that this should lead to economic and social position and respect. And that's the best defense against radicalism.
Thank you very much. I'll take 3 more questions. We're actually at the end of our time, but our guest of honor for the reception is 15 minutes late. So
just carry on talking.
We can carry on talking for another 10 minutes, if it's okay for you. So please, there was a question here, and then again the lady here, and the lady here, and here.
I'd like to drag the discussion down a bit from the lofty level it's been on so far. Mr. Stockhammer delivered the cue. It's been said a few times that radicalization is a matter of grievances, and I think that's a key statement. You see it in the banlieues in Paris, and I'm sure you see it in Germany and elsewhere too. I'm trying to think, how would I feel if I move around in town and everybody's looking askance at me? And the German stand-up comedian Dieter Nuhr said once, how about if we look at the strangers as friends we haven't yet got to know? And whenever I travel on the subway now, and I see someone who appears to be down and out or having an unpleasant existence, I try to give a friendly smile. And I have no illusion that I'm preventing terrorism. But I'd like to think that if those people are met every day by 15 or 20 friendly smiles, I think it will help. And if, like is the case with our present Foreign Secretary and Chairman of the OSCE or the Home Secretary, if there are always being made insinuations and accusations that, say, the refugees are here only to abuse the social system, I mean, that's going to cause grievances. If someone, like a panelist on tomorrow's energy discussion, keeps writing articles claiming that young refugee males come here only in the hope of becoming gang leaders. I mean, that creates a climate in the population which cannot lead to good. As Mr. Stockhammer said, the efforts has to come from below and not
Thanks
from the...
for the statement, and that's something to take home. Smile more at people. So here we have 3 ladies, 1, 2, and 3. Please, you can be the first one, yes. Yes, you, stand up again. But you need a microphone.
Thank you. We have already talked about the use of disillusioned returning fighters, which for counter-narratives, which uses dialogue-based counter-narratives. my question is about the implementation of this type of strategy. What are the difficulties faced in the implementation of dialogue-based counter-narratives versus one-sided messages? And the question is directed at everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank
I'll
you.
take now all the questions and then have a closing round. Please here, yes?
I'm a student of this academy, but I also studied Arabic studies. And I would like to say that I think we cannot deny that conservative Salafi Islam is on the rise, not only in Europe, but in every Arabic country. And I would like to know what we can do to increase moderate Islam and how we can increase it and support it.
Thank you very much. Then, right before that, yes?
Hi, so I have a background in international relations and currently work in journalism here in Vienna. And I would like to make one comment and one question. The comment would be that, in my opinion, and I don't know if this is shared, but speaking about moderate Islam is actually maybe dangerous in a sense, because it almost pretends as if Islam only, standalone Islam, is somehow radical, is somehow extreme. So I think maybe, for me at least personally, I think we should pay attention of how we talk about Islam, and putting this moderate Islam into almost one word might actually harm the conversation in general. That was my comment. Now my question is slightly different, and I don't know exactly if the panel can or wants to really address it, but I was thinking about radicalization in the sense of nationalism. So in Germany, there's plenty of incidences, but also here in Austria, where asylum centers have been attacked, asylum seekers as individuals, and there's been a lot of racist rhetoric, not just rhetoric, but actual actions which caused victims. So what are we doing about that? Because that also promotes populism, essentially. So the dialogue.
Thanks a lot for the question. It was my first question to Mr. Neumann. You're the first to pick it up. And there was another on this side. Back there, waving. Yes.
Okay. My name is Liana Suleimanova, and I'm a PhD student here. Yeah. Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
My research area is the Western Balkans, so I wanted to bring the question to the Balkans. Basically, one of the phenomena that we can see there in the Balkans, is this kind of radicalization for pragmatic reasons that happens in Kosovo, for example. Former fighters during the war, they go and join ISIS and other radical groups to earn money, or because essentially they think that the one skill that they do have is that they know how to fight. So how do you de-radicalize people like that? How do you help the situation in this case? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Very good question. And I'll take one more here, the gentleman in the third row, fourth.
So my name is Peter Felch. I'm a former staff of 2 OSCE field missions and several election observation missions. So my first question is, you were talking about the exploitation of fears and concerns by populist tendencies. There are quite a few Austrians who are concerned about recent statements and initiatives of the Austrian Minister of Foreign Affairs and
So would like a comment on that.
My question would be, what would the OSCE tell its chairman in office in this regard, or would recommend? Second question is, you didn't touch upon the role of media in this whole exploitation, also exploitation by fears by the media. Maybe I overheard it, or is there a reason why you didn't address this issue? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we'll go back for a last round on the podium. We have 1 minute each. So that's, more or less. Would you like to start, Mr. Stockhammer?
I would like to start with the very last question. because I also think this is a crucial point. The role of the media, I would see it as a catalysator of the message. So terrorism is a strategy of communication which uses violence as its means. There is a famous quote by Brian Jenkins, terrorists want a lot of people watching, not a lot of people dead. So you provide the medium for this, and so media are responsible for what they are broadcasting and to which extent they are broadcasting incidents, and also in the formulation of their reports. I have especially in Austria, seen several cases of print media where there had been headlines like terrorism will overrun Austria, and so they are creating fear, and they are the administrators of this fear. So not all of them. So I think quality media are now in charge of correcting a false image in the population.
Perhaps I could add to that at Pro7sat.1+4 we have a very strict protocol of how to deal with terrorist incidents. For example, we never use images that were released by terrorists, so we don't use ISIS propaganda, we'd rather use no image. And we try not to convey their message of fear. Mm-hmm. But I must say that we've been having this for 9 months, and we're still the only ones, so it's not really spreading around as I hoped. Mr. Rahmat? There's some questions open. One is moderate Islam that was addressed from two sides. Yeah. One person saying we should promote it, and one person saying that it might be dangerous to use the word.
I think, first of all, it is Western I'm speaking about perceptions. And it is Western perception that moderate Islam in many countries, perhaps there is a moderate Islam, but the danger comes from the fundamentalist, from the violent Islam. And for the Westerners, it's difficult to distinguish one from another. There is a perception, not statistical evidence, but perception that terrorism and Islam, at least the great majority of terrorists, for reasons which is difficult to understand in the Western mind, that Islam generates terrorism. I would like to address the question which came there in the back, and actually thought that it is a very good point to point out that the transition from military experience to a civilian one, it does not take Islam to complicate this issue. There is an issue of post-traumatic syndrome when the veterans are coming home, regardless pretty much of their religious, cultural, etc. background. It is a very difficult transition. This is a transition which can be simplified to a simple issue, transition from carrying a gun and feeling extremely important, etc., to taking a pen and using it. It's a tremendous psychological transition. Consequently, very often, if you look at the number of revolutionaries could not make that transition. And in some countries, you use revolutionaries to make a revolution, then you get rid of revolutionaries, and you go to bureaucrats because you don't make revolutionary bureaucrat. Media, especially American media, which I read from time to time, is set for sensation. And this is a danger because it goes counter-education, it triggers all these paranoid feelings, etc. You really have to be selective if you want to read what is balanced, factually based, and rational. It's a long way for the Western society to establish a rational approach to this very emotional issue, which could be very painful in individual cases. I'm done.
Thank you very much. There was a question on counter-narratives, dialogue-based versus
Excellent question, and the short answer would be it's too early to tell. I just read a very interesting study about how we evaluate and assess counter-narratives or, in principle, countering violent extremism, all kinds of efforts. And there is no single answer because our efforts are, in a way, relatively recent. And you would need to have a lot of studies before you can, authoritatively conclude that dialogue is better than, for example, negative messaging or positive messaging. For the time being, we actually try a number of approaches in different countries. I mean, if you look even at, for example, European context, different countries chose different approaches. And there is no one blueprint. I mean, different countries push different agendas and differently approach the matter. And I think, we are yet to find out which one is the most efficient, and also how do you check whether a person, for example, was prevented from joining ISIL or becoming radical extremist. He may not be joining ISIL now, but he may join in a year's time. I mean, the point is, you can't really authoritatively assess, yes, because of my dialogue with Mr. X or Mr. Y, the person has been, prevented from joining, a terrorist organization. One, in response to your question about moderate Islam, and that's strictly in my personal capacity, I think so many non-scholars address the issue that, there is this credibility issue. So many, people who do not know about Islam comment about Islam, and now suddenly it's so popular to refer to moderate Islam. Basically, everyone does it. And if you just ask what exactly do you mean by moderate Islam, and suddenly there would be this blank face because they're not prepared to answer. I mean, are we really, as a Christian, am I really, and as clearly as a non-scholar in Islam, am I really there to suggest that, what's the difference between the two, really radical Islam and non-radical Islam? I mean, again, it's about this credibility. If you want to preach something, you have to make sure that, you have enough of knowledge and expertise to suggest something. And I think sometimes we take this kind of bird's eye view and suggest certain things without really meaning. And the last point about the Balkans, and the one issue that we are currently addressing, and that stems from our field operations in Southeastern Europe, and that is about radicalization in prisons. It's a new topic. We haven't dealt with this topic before, but we have received requests from a number of our heads of missions in the Balkans, and we are now having a meeting later this month with experts from a number of international organizations, but also from ODIHR, to look into this, because a number of scholars suggested that actually it's prisons which are the incubators of radicalism, and it's particularly so in some of the Western Balkan countries. So we will be exploring this issue. Again, there is no recipe at this stage, but this is something that we will be looking into.
Thank you very much. Last, Mr. Neumann, there's this question open about right-wing extremism, right-wing radicalization, nationalism.
Of course, and all of these are of concern, and of course it is also true that one of the effects and one of the desired effects of what groups like Islamic State are doing is to create that polarization that creates a breeding ground also for other kinds of extremism. And certainly what we've seen in a number of European societies is that different types of extremism are egging each other on and are creating a situation where the space in the middle of society becomes harder and harder, which is, of course, exactly what extremists want. And that brings me, as a response to a number of the comments that were made here, I don't actually think it is necessarily about economic opportunity per se or about education per se. It is ultimately, the end game of it is about a sense of belonging, feeling part of society and feeling accepted as part of society. If I look at how Islamic State, but also other organizations are trying to recruit young Western Muslims, they are saying to them, the country that you were born in, the country whose passport you have, whose language you speak, is in fact at war with you. You're not part of that society. The West is at war with Islam. You cannot be a Muslim and a French person, or you cannot be a Muslim and an American at the same time. You have to choose. And of course, if the person who receives those messages has experiences of marginalization, of exclusion, of discrimination, of feeling that he doesn't have opportunities in society, then that message has a chance of resonating. If that person feels like he belongs into society, that he has opportunities, that he can make it even though his name is Mohammed, then that message will not resonate. So it's not only about economic opportunity, education. All of that is part of the same picture, which is about integrating people into society. And for that, two things are necessary. One is to give people a very clear idea of what is expected of them, to communicate laws and social norms, but also, once they adhere to those social norms and laws, then to say, your name may be Mohammed, but you're French, you're Austrian, you're German, and you get every opportunity that everyone else has. And that's ultimately the compact that we need to accomplish. There are rules, but if you stick to the rules, you're part of us.
Thank you very much for these wonderful closing words. Round of applause for the panel. And our guest of honor has arrived. Welcome, Ulrike Lunacek, and I'll hand back to Hannes, to the organizers.
Distinguished guests, we have had 4 amazing panels today with really lively discussions on all of them. Latest after this last panel, it is for sure clear to everyone as to why the Austrian chairmanship chose radicalization as one of their main topics to be addressed this year. Thank you very much for coming to this panel and giving us a deep insight from various perspectives. Also, I deeply thank all of you, ladies and gentlemen, for being with us today at DASICon 2017 and for all the interesting questions you asked.